Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Rajesh Merchandani, the Vice President of Communications and Policy Outreach here at the Centre for Global Development. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to launch our brand new report, which you all have copies of, Shared Border, Shared Future, a blueprint to regulate US-Mexico labour mobility. I'm sure you'd agree it comes at a critical time for this issue, and it asks a key question. How can we make an immigration policy that works, that addresses the root cause of the problems and the politics that we see today, namely the illegality of much migration? How can we make a system that protects American workers but offers opportunity to Mexicans to come and improve the lives of their families? How can we make an immigration system that benefits both countries and that politicians from both sides of the growing divide can support? We think we have one way how in the report. Let's just set out right now, though, that this report does not examine the issue of the millions of people currently here without documentation. The authors of the report see the root causes of many current problems in past failures to properly regulate future flows. Right now, net current flows between Mexico and the US are approaching zero. So now is actually the time to get future flows right. The report also focuses not on high-skilled workers, but on low-skill labor. It's about temporary, legal, employment-based, regulated, low-skill Mexican labor supply to the US economy, something that the US economy needs. We put together an illustrious group of experts from both countries and both sides of the political divide, from the highest levels of government and from all sides of the debate: labor advocates, employers groups, national security experts, scholars in law, economics, and politics. Some of our most experienced and eminent panelists are on stage today. In the middle, Doris Meissner, now Senior Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and a former Commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. Carlos Gutierrez, a former U.S. Secretary of Commerce under George W. Bush and now Chair of the Albright-Stonebridge Group and a co-chair of our working group. The op-ed that he co-authored with the other co-chair, President Ernesto Zedillo, former president of Mexico, appeared in the New York Times yesterday and in Spanish today. You can find copies of it outside, so please do have a read of that. And also, of course, many of you will recognize CGD's very own senior fellow, Michael Clements, our migration expert, whose research underpins the logic of this formal bilateral agreement that is in both countries' interests, and he was the lead author on the report. As I mentioned, another co-chair is Mexico's former president, Ernesto Zedillo, who can't be with us this morning, but he did send a short video message, and we can take a little look at that right now.
The fact that people are upset about the present state of affairs should lead to search for new approaches. And I am convinced, because I believe in open markets, I believe in globalization, I believe in international cooperation, that the solution is not to be found in isolation. I think that's very important, because isolation will not be good for the United States. It will be against the history of the success of this country, and it will not be good for the partners, including Mexico, of the United States. So we need to think about new approaches to address legitimate concerns, and those approaches must be a win-win approach. And that's what we are trying to provide in this report.
So that was former President of Mexico, Ernesto Zedillo, stressing that at the very key of this report, the very heart of it, is cooperation, the kind of cooperation that happens anyway between Mexico and the US when it comes to, say, trade between the two countries, which is vast, but that we desperately need in the area of migration regulation. The op-ed that I mentioned gives some details. It sort of previewed the report, but let's get some more now. I'm going to invite Michael Clements, the lead author of the report, to just tell us a little bit more about what's in it. Michael.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me if I talk like this? So I was a young man living in Southern California in the early 90s. I had a lot of Mexican friends, and they had a nickname for the United States. It was a play on words in Spanish. They called it the United State Quietos, which means the United Stay There. And over the last year, you've heard politicians articulating a very dark vision of the future migration relationship between these countries that have been dealing with that relationship for many generations. You've heard that what's missing is that we need more mutual suspicion and more dismissive insults and more militarization and barriers. What President Cedillo and Secretary Gutierrez, the chairs of this group, have done is put together the best people in the business from both countries to articulate a completely different vision of that, of the future relationship between these two countries on migration. So they argue, and I believe very strongly, that what's missing is more grounding in shared history and destiny. That what's missing is more pragmatism and facts, and what's missing is more innovation. So I want to tell you exactly what the group means by that. This group didn't just get together to write down principles. They actually drafted a framework agreement for what they imagine would be an extremely specific vision of how an agreement could work. It's an appendix of the report available in both languages. So here's what I mean by we need more grounding in shared history and destiny. I'm pretty sure that almost no Americans realize that the fraction of the labor force of Kansas that was Mexican-born was much higher in 1930 than it was in 1990. The same is true of Colorado. The same is true of New Mexico. The same is true of Arizona. Mexican migration to work and add value to the US economy is not something that just happened in the 80s and 90s after the '82 crisis. It's something that is a tradition of our grandparents and great-grandparents. And it's something that politicians can decide to create pragmatic, flexible legal pathways for or decide to illegalize. But it's something that predates all of us and will last long, long past all of us. The second that Rajesh just summarized very nicely is that this report is focused on future flows. What the group believes is that the fundamental element of negotiating this relationship that has been missing is considering future flows of labor across the border. In 1986, which was the last time, really, that there was a fundamental re-envisioning of US immigration policy, this was the thing that was missing. And it was missing so badly that the 1986 reform that was billed in this city as a once-and-for-all solution to black market migration at the southwest border lasted less than 4 years. Once-and-for-all permanent solution lasted less than 4 years. In this sense, by 1990, there were more unauthorized workers in the United States than there were before 1986. More, about 3 million. And from there, of course, it almost quadrupled. And what was fundamentally missing in 1986, which focused, like the discussion does today, on the status of people who are here and on heroic enforcement measures, was a realistic, pragmatic, flexible regulatory framework for accommodating gigantic changes that were happening on both sides of the border. In the 1980s, the demographic transition of Mexico was just cresting. It was heading for a peak of a historic maximum in the number of young Mexicans entering the labor force at the same time that the baby boomers were aging out of their 20s in the 80s, and there was the biggest drop ever in US history in the number of young people in the labor force here. A gigantic opportunity for mutually beneficial exchange. Add to that the 1982 crisis in Mexico and many other forces. Then in 1986, there was this immigration reform that didn't address future flows in any serious and realistic way. That is the fundamental reason why we have ended up with a gigantic black market across the border and all of the human toll, all of the harms to laborers, all of the harms to local and state government coffers, and the many other harms that has brought. Not fundamentally the migration itself, which has been tremendously beneficial in many ways. And there are people in this room right now and watching online whose parents have been taken care of by some of those people, whose children were raised, or they themselves raised by some of those people, whose homes were built by some of those people, whose lunch today will be prepared in the back kitchen by some of those people. An integral part of our lives in ways that are not always easy to see. The third thing that this group thinks is missing is cooperation. 1986 and many other immigration reforms in the US recently have been fundamentally unilateral. The two countries have not cooperated to regulate labor mobility in any serious way since 1965. 51 years of unilateral policy, and the catastrophe that happened in the meanwhile has happened in a complete vacuum of cooperation. The fourth thing that the group thinks we need more of is innovation, because those agreements that ended in 1965, the Bracero agreements, were terribly flawed. They had a lot of problems. Among them was tying migrants to a single employer without any serious recourse to pursue their rights as workers, which leads to all kinds of problems, not just for Mexican workers, but certainly for US workers who work alongside them. That was a critical flaw, along with many others that needs to be changed. However, I do want to point out that cooperation is not at all impossible. Not just on labor mobility did the United States and Mexico have formal agreements in 1910 and 1917 and 1942 to 1965, but in several other areas of trade, investment, environmental regulation, the regulation of rivers, there is active cooperation between these governments. It's not at all unthinkable, unrealistic pie in the sky to think that two countries with such a tremendous potential for mutual benefit through labor mobility could cooperate to regulate it. They have done so. But I want to mention just a handful of numerous innovations that are in the report. This is not your grandparents' proposal for a bilateral labor agreement. It's a proposal to break the mold and make an agreement for the 21st century. It proposes sectoral portability among employers of the visas. This is absolutely critical to maximizing the productivity of those workers and therefore their ability to generate jobs in the American economy, as well as protecting their rights as workers. It proposes a system of fees to ensure that it is in the interest of US employers to hire US workers when they are available for these jobs. It proposes what I think is quite an innovative compromise between having no visa quota at all, like the current seasonal agricultural work visa, the H-2A visa, or a baked-in, rigid, legislated quota that cannot respond to any changes in demographic or market conditions, like the current H-1B visa. Instead, it suggests a limit on the change, the year-to-year change in the number of visas that can be given, which I think is quite an interesting and pragmatic compromise between those two extremes, which either of which can be very problematic. In that way, it protects the United States and workers and fiscal systems from sudden, unexpected inflows of workers, while at the same time allowing those flows to respond as they should to big changes on either side of the border. One last one I want to mention is something that Doris has spoken about for years. The group proposes the creation of a bilateral labor markets commission. The United States has had for literally a century the International Trade Commission, celebrating, I think this month, its centenary. It has had an agency to provide credible, technocratic, independent advice on the effects of changes in US trade policy. There's nothing like that for migration. That's left to the websites and the let's say, think tanks of varying quality that like to comment on this issue. There's nobody you can go to in the United States government and get an objective opinion about whether labor market conditions in the country at this time warrant a certain number of workers with certain number of skills to come in. Finally, what's missing is pragmatic dialogue across the border. And I just want to triple down on something that Rajesh said. This is just an incredible group. What President Seguin and Carlos Gutierrez put together is unprecedented. There are people from both sides of the border There are Republicans and Democrats. There's PRI and PAN. There's practitioners and academics. There's labor and employers. There's the son of a bracero. There is the former El Paso sector chief of the US Border Patrol. There is the former head of Mexico's National Security Intelligence Agency, as well as the expertise that's sitting on this stage next to me. This is just, there's never been a more credible, diverse group to comment on this issue. The fact that they all put their names on one report with such detail in it is something of a miracle, because in other areas, this is not a group that agrees on very much. But they agree on this report, and that makes it something that I think is worth very serious consideration for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Michael. So Michael mentioned some of the policy innovations included in the report. We may talk a little bit about them in greater detail later on during the discussion. But first, for our other two guests, I want to invite you to kind of take a little bit of a step back, a kind of higher level view. So Carlos Gutierrez, first of all, former Secretary of Commerce. We heard from your fellow co-chair, former President of Mexico, about why he thinks this is important. I'm just wondering, given your time in government, when part of your job would have been to help create jobs for Americans in America, tell us a little bit about the efforts to address immigration that you have seen tried and fail, and what you think this report does that previous efforts have not been able to do.
Well, one of the things that is often overlooked when we talk about immigration and when we have discussions and debates about immigration is that immigration is primarily an economic issue. It's an economic tool. It's become emotional, it's become political, but the reality is that if our workforce doesn't grow, our economy can't grow, and there are jobs that are filled by immigrants. So today we have a black market for labor because we don't have a transparent, workable system that allows legal labor to come in. So therefore that's substituted by a black market with smugglers, with coyotes, where everyone loses. That's one thing that this addresses. And I would say the other thing that's very important is that this is a bilateral agreement. We are recommending a bilateral agreement between the US and Mexico where we have shared accountability for border security, shared accountability for how workers come to the US, how they access jobs, how they apply. So it is a truly workable system. And as you mentioned at the beginning, which is important to highlight, it is focused on low-skilled labor. So instead of trying to take on this comprehensive approach, we're taking it piece by piece, but this is a very large and important piece.
Doris Meissner, I mean, you also have huge experience from different perspectives on this issue as Commissioner of the INS, now at the Migration Policy Institute. What have you seen in your career that has helped you understand what needs to happen to fix our current immigration challenges? And tell us how this report fits into that in your view.
Well, I have to start that answer by saying that I think it's pretty clear that our problem today and for many years has been a problem of politics, not of policy. There have been lots of good policy ideas. We've been on stages like this a number of times, through different iterations of them. So it's not that there haven't been creative ideas and creative efforts put together. And of course, the frustrating thing about the political stalemate is that it is won over issues that the public disagree. It's not representative of what public opinion is. So there's this terrible disconnect between Congress and the way in which Congress has blocked progress and how public attitudes actually have developed around these issues. So the people that have worked on this, by and large, and groups like this, don't have a lot of ability to change that political picture. But at the same time, ideas matter. And ideas do, over time, make a difference. And so I think that what's happening here with this report, what Michael has described in terms of the group that's come together, the broad range of views that have been represented, et cetera, is a very important demonstration of thought leadership. Thought leadership is a critical piece of moving public policy and moving change forward. And this particular group is a group that's not only, as Michael said, broadly diverse, it involves two countries. And I don't, there have been efforts at that to some extent in the past, but this is a really robust effort where that's concerned. And I think that that's incredibly important because at the end of the day, once elections are over, et cetera, there definitely are people in Congress that are undercover at this point that really would like to come out into the light and do something about these issues. And when you have efforts like this, it helps give them cover. It helps give them some protection to put their toe in the water and take on these issues that they presently view as being issues that will only punish them, from their constituencies. So what I like about this report and what I like about this effort, as against that backdrop, is that it deals with the issue of guest workers, and let's call it that. I mean, we're calling it labor mobility, et cetera, but in terms of the politics surrounding this issue, it deals with the issue of guest workers, which is a core issue for Republicans. Core issue that Republicans see as a way of dealing with the immigration issue. And I don't think that it is partisan to say that it is more important at this point to try to get Republicans to the table in the House than Democrats. I mean, there are all sorts of issues with Democrats, but the stalemate that has to be broken, I think at this point, is more a Republican stalemate. And so I think that focusing on this issue of guest workers and how one could incorporate some kind of a guest worker feature in an overall immigration solution is constructive and useful. And I think it's also, another thing that I like about this effort is that it is affirmatively saying we are not trying to solve the whole problem. We are looking at one aspect of the problem, guest workers and two countries that have had this long historic relationship. And affirmatively saying we're not trying to solve the whole thing, I think at this point is a real strength. Because the word comprehensive and the word all putting things together has become a bad word and a non-starter. It has stopped the conversation. So by being able to say, here's just one pathway, here's one set of ideas, doesn't solve every part of it, and yes, it does link to the other issues, but still, it can be a somewhat self-standing issue, I think is a real strength here. At the same time, this is not a small bore thing. This idea of a framework agreement, of two countries coming together, of the historic relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, that is a big idea. And the aspects of the idea that I think that attract me the most are two things. Number one, the flexibility, which Michael talked about. I think it is absolutely essential that we find ways to build flexibility that can be market sensitive and shift based on changing conditions on the ground into our immigration system as compared with fixing in statute for decades at a time particular numbers. And so the flexibility and the framework that's here for flexibility that is sensitive, it takes into account numbers and levels, but it isn't tied to them, I think is a really important, feature here. The other thing that I think is very important is that it is bilateral. And this, for me, represents a real shift that I think is important and I want to highlight because I've been part of it. And that is that we have thought for a very long time that, and most of our politicians believe, that immigration and immigration policy is a domestic issue. And therefore, it is the creature of domestic politics and of our legislative structures, et cetera, which is certainly true. But many of us have argued and have worked very hard to take the sense that we need to get our own house in order first. Obviously, this is a broader issue. Obviously, it involves other countries. It's regional. But until we get our house in order, we can't really, go further than that. But what this report is saying is, let's try a different approach. And I am persuaded that the get our own house in order approach is been tried so many times. It's not going to work. And meanwhile, time is marching on. So I think it's really very constructive to put on the table what would it look like as an opening discussion if the two countries that have the biggest stake in this and the biggest history in this actually were to come up with something, with each other to put into the mix. And this is one where, as you say, Michael, history is very much in our favor. We, the United States, are connected to our neighbors, connected to this region as much as anything by the migration history and migration patterns and interconnectivity on the ground that migration represents. And so I do think that putting that frame into the conversation in a way that might create a different set of lenses for how we can break this logjam that we're in has some longer term promise.
Thanks, Doris. Carlos, please.
Build on that.
Yeah.
A big part of this is just arithmetic. In the last effort that was tried, 2010, around that time, Doris mentioned that we have these quotas that are set in law, and they stay in the law for years and years and years. So in that attempt at reform, there was a quota for farm workers of 110,000. And every farm organization that I've spoken with and farmers will say, look, on a typical year, we need anywhere from 750,000 to 1 million farm workers. But our quota is 110,000. Where do you get, what happens now? And that's where the black market comes in. And so you're giving farmers three options. One is go to the black market. Two is shut down your farm and perhaps move it to Mexico. And that, for me, is just a picture of what's happening in the country, because we fail to recognize that this is a necessity for our economy. The other thing that Doris mentioned, what I think is important, is we always focus on the undocumented workers who are here. And we think that that fixes the problem. So let's build a wall, let's do something about the 11 million people, but we don't think about the future. We don't think about future flows. So therefore, it's just a matter of time before we have the same problem again. And this report focuses on the future. What are we going to do to eliminate this black market and have a transparent, workable system that doesn't hurt workers on either side of the border?
Okay, thank you both. Michael, I wonder if I can kind of call on you now just to kind of put a little more flesh on the bones of some of the policy innovations that are included in the report. Doris was talking about the flexible caps as one of the things she really liked about the report. Carlos, you're nodding. I wonder if you could just explain to people, without delving into the mathematical formula that you devised, just tell us the basics of what's the principle behind the kind of flexible caps that you've innovated in the report.
It's simply, so Either you put a number in the agreement or you don't. If you don't put a number in the agreement, you're saying any number of people can come at any time. There's no limit to the number of visas that can be given. That's an extreme of flexibility that allows for instantaneous adjustment to changing market conditions, to a crash in the United States, to a crash in Mexico. But it has also adjustment costs. There's a Congressional Research Service report and a lot of other research suggesting that sudden changes in the flow of migrants, especially to certain areas of the US, can put big fiscal burdens on local and state governments, among other things. The other alternative, as we've discussed, is to stick a number in there, and then you get quite extraordinary situations like the current situation with the H-1B visa. There is an annual allotment for the entire year, and it typically runs out in a few hours. Hours, on one day in April. That's the kind of rigidity you get when a number is inserted into legislation that is extraordinarily difficult to change and cannot possibly respond to unforeseeable events. They had to make a special dispensation when the Y2K happened to get more programmers into the United States to fix Y2K. No, I remember 1995, 96, 97, nobody had any idea that Y2K was going to happen. We don't know what is going to be the situation of farming, of IT, of nursing, even a few years from now. It's literally impossible, even for top economic experts, to sit in a room and say, 4 years from now, here's exactly how many people you're going to need to pick tomatoes and sweet potatoes. A compromise between those two is simply to propose a rate at which the flow of people can change, maximum. In the report, they suggest a number. In a real agreement, it should be negotiated between the parties. But the fundamental innovation is the concept that it is important for various reasons to cushion the blow when there are shocks on either side of the border, unforeseeable shocks as they're certain to arrive. It's also important to maintain flexibility, and what we call the decelerator safeguard cap is a cap that can move, but can only move at a maximum rate that the parties should determine.
So if there's a kind of sudden economic downturn in the US, then the number of migrant workers who'd be allowed in the following year goes down.
It would change smoothly year to year, and there's also a provision in the draft agreement in the appendix of the report for when there are historic increases in unemployment in the U.S., such as spiking above 8%, which has only happened a few times in U.S. history. The floating cap would reset down to a very low level.
And another innovation to kind of protect US workers, which is one of the kind of issues in the American political system that needs to be navigated in this report, is the idea of fees. US priority fees. Just summarize that for us.
It is important for such an agreement to maintain priority of US workers for jobs. What the report proposes is, as an alternative to the current foreign labor certification process, adapting a process that's quite similar to what is now done in New Zealand with a very successful temporary employment visa system called the Recognized Seasonal Employer Scheme, which combines a system called the labor condition attestation, in which the employer attests to the Department of Labor that they are not able to locate timely qualified labor locally, and pays a fee in order to hire foreign workers in that situation that is set high enough to both generate revenue to run the agreement, make it fiscally neutral, immediately fiscally neutral, not just in terms of the long-term tax revenue which would be generated by additional productivity, but immediately in the same year fiscally neutral, and guarantee that it is in the interest of US employers in that moment to get US workers when they can, because they don't have to pay the fee.
Doris and Carlos, why is it so crucial, do you think, for this report that that issue of protecting US workers is so central to it?
Because it's so central. I mean, you know, that's our first responsibility, obviously, as a country. And you know, as Carlos has said, when you have the current situation, which is a totally laissez-faire situation and a black market, is the worst circumstance for American workers. because they can be underbid at any point by the vulnerability of the workforce that doesn't have any protections and isn't regulated. But it's also a very important selling point and a very important feature for the workability and viability of any kind of a program like this.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a very central political issue, and it's very easy to say, well, we're taking jobs away from American workers. Well, we have a black market, and if you have a black market, you have a market. And there's a sense that there is demand. So the report talks about ensuring that you have offered jobs to American workers before you bring someone in from Mexico. So there is that feature and there is that mechanism which I believe is incredibly important, and to get it through in a bipartisan way.
I want to know, Michael's research has shown that, at the macro level, Mexicans coming here doesn't take jobs away from Americans. It increases productivity and creates jobs for Americans. But for the politics of this issue, it almost doesn't matter what the facts are. So how do you get around that? You two who've had so many years between you in kind of the political realm of this, how do you get around that?
Look, I think that you have to go out and talk to businesses and hear from businesses firsthand what they are confronting because they don't have the labor. An example, I was talking to a restaurant owner. This is anecdotal, but for me it was very tangible. He said, look, I own 3 restaurants. If I could find more workers, I would have 8 restaurants. And if I had 8 restaurants, I would hire more US citizens to have to manage a bigger operation. And you can multiply that by whatever number you want, but that's what's happening today in the country. That our businesses are not being served. And if anything, as we said before, they're being served by a black market, and I think our economy deserves better.
Then do you say to the people who, and we talked about this earlier, what do you say to the people who would argue that why do you need Mexicans to help that man set up 8 restaurants? Why don't you use American workers?
Well, again, one of the mechanisms in this report is that you have to offer the job and you have to make it known for American workers first. I know it sounds like a cliche to say there are jobs that Americans won't do. And I'm convinced of that, and we have seen it, and that is why we have a black market. Not because the wall isn't high enough, but because we don't have people to go into specific jobs. And I'm talking farm workers, I'm talking other type of work. People have tried. People have tried desperately to do it legally, and they failed. It's not as if though business is doing it just for the sake of bringing in cheap labor.
I just want to say, I'm a research geek. I deal with numbers all day, but this stuff is incredibly tangible, and you can see it yourself. I could tell you that Giovanni Peri of UC Davis and Chad Sparber of Colgate do regressions showing that low-skilled Mexican immigrants complement U.S. workers. But you can go into a restaurant from here down to the street and just watch workers complimenting each other. The people in the back kitchen preparing the food, the guy clearing your table, who may not speak English very well, is making the native English-speaking person taking your order more productive. Both of them together are making the MBA managing the restaurant more productive. All of them are working together, they're complementing each other, and you can see it in front of your eyes. I could tell you that Patricia Cortes of BU and Jose Tesada have shown statistically that in US cities where there has been greater low-skill immigration, especially from Mexico, the labor force participation of highly skilled women with master's degrees and PhDs is higher. Why? Because they have better access to affordable childcare. And I'll bet that most people in this room know somebody who has had to face that decision. And the extraordinarily high cost of childcare has played into that decision, and I know several. This is something that you can look up in extremely rigorous research in well-respected journals, but you can go see it this afternoon. It's subtle, you need to look for it, but it's there.
And to all of you, just before we open up to questions from the audience, just give me a sense of why you think now is the right time to try and address the immigration issue or part of the immigration issue with innovations like this in this way, bilateral, bipartisan, flexible, practical, based on facts. Why is that? Why is now the time for that?
Because the people that organized this a year and a half ago were able to foresee that there was going to be the kind of an election debate that, I mean, you don't ever know about timing.
Someone's going to get very rich off the result.
You don't ever know about timing. But the fact of the matter is that this issue is not going away. And whatever, whatever failures in our political system keep making it, impossible to resolve are going to pop up again in some other way. So, this, it's not that this is a more perfect or less perfect time than any other time. This issue is an issue of our times. And so this is coming along. This work got finished. This approach at trying to deal with it in a slightly different way, gives us a tool to re-engage perhaps in something that has to be resolved at some point.
I would say also that we're about to make the same mistake again, or we're talking about it in a sense that we're going to make the same mistake again, which is we have to deal with all the undocumented workers who are here as a result of the fact that our laws are insufficient or inappropriate or do not serve our economy. So we'll deal with them in whatever fashion. There are different ways and different concepts and different ideas, but unless we deal with the future flow, again, we will have this problem in 5 years, in 10 years. It'll just keep happening. So before we do something just where we think it's immigration, dealing with immigration is dealing with the people who are here already, if we think that's sufficient, we're just going to repeat history. And it's happened in the 20s, it's happened after the Bracero program. You take something away or you fix a situation for people who are here, but you don't have a process for future flows, you're just asking for trouble. And,
I mean, just to build on that, I do think that it is really important to emphasize again a point that Michael made at the beginning in terms of the timing on this, which, again, we could not necessarily have foreseen, but it's fortuitous. We are at a historic level, low of illegal immigration from Mexico as a current phenomenon. I mean, the post-Bracero phenomenon, the change that was brought about by the change in our laws in 1965 that has led to this large flow and the black market that goes with it is basically over. The public does not believe that. There is not anything that we're really seeing in our current public debate that acknowledges that. In fact, border enforcement is working quite well based on what you can expect from enforcement, along with the convergence of dramatic changes in Mexico, differences in our own labor market and in demands for workers. So in fact, where the timing is concerned, we really are at a point where there is the road is going in a different direction. We're at an inflection point. And so the idea of what it is that we're going to do about future flows and what it is that is likely when you look down the road in terms of the US economy, this is the right time.
Doris said it better than I, but I also want to point out that you read in the headlines, well, migration from Mexico is just over because the net rate is so low. And as Doris pointed out, the illegal migration in particular is lower now than it's been in my entire lifetime. It wasn't at these low levels since around 1970. But there is now and will continue to be a lot of mobility across the border. A net flow hovering near zero conceals, according to Pew Research, a flow of about 150 to 175,000 in each direction each year. And what matters for visas and regulation is the gross flow. That is, a net flow of zero can still need a lot of visas either to be regulated or a black market, and that's the choice.
It's interesting that during the Great Recession, undocumented immigration or illegal immigration declined. Why? Because there weren't jobs. And the unemployment rate among undocumented workers is always well below the national average. Why? Because the reason they come is because there are jobs that aren't getting filled. If those jobs weren't here, they wouldn't be coming over. So again, the magnet is not that we don't have a wall. The magnet is that there are jobs that we cannot fill with U.S. citizens.
Okay. Thanks very much, panel. Let's get some questions from the audience. What I'm going to do is that we have a microphone going around. If I call on you, I'll take questions probably in groups of 3. Please introduce yourself, say your affiliation, and then I encourage you, rather than making lengthy statements, to go straight to a pithy and concise question. Let's start with this gentleman, then let's have this gentleman, and then this gentleman, and then women in the audience, I urge you to contribute as well. 3 gentlemen, not having that.
Sorry. Be a gentleman. But first, congratulations to Michael Clements to remind us that we have centuries of flow across the border. The borders exist in new eras, you may say. And it's great that they were in Colorado and Arizona and Texas and other places. Second, and just one point, infrastructure. No matter who is the next president, we're going to have a lot of investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure requires low-skilled workers of various kinds. They have to develop special skills, but I foresee a huge investment in infrastructure and linking in some way or other in the laws which are going to be passed to pay for that infrastructure. How about putting in some words about workers? That might include workers who are not necessarily U.S. citizens already. Thanks.
I'll let Michael address some of the policy details, but I think it's an excellent point. Going back to the last attempt, which again, 2010, 2011, there was another quota for low-skilled construction work, and that quota was 25,000. And I used to say, we need 25,000 in Miami, let alone the U.S. So, but it's a great way of looking to the future, and that's the kind of work that this bilateral commission should do, is look to the future. What's happening? What's coming? What will the demand be, so that we're not in a position where we are, once again, opening the door for a black market?
I just say, imagine a world where instead of hurling insults at each other, we sat in a room like this and thought about opportunities for mutual benefit, and you just did, and thank you for that.
Let's get a couple more questions. This gentleman, and then the gentleman at the front, and then this lady here.
Good morning. Thank you for your time and wisdom. I'm Juan Carlos Iturregui. I'm here in my personal capacity. You include a great model term sheet for an agreement. So I'm wondering, I'm assuming this would have to take the form of a treaty. So I'm wondering if you have identified or would work with any champions in the Senate in order to time this with a potential comprehensive immigration reform bill that may or may not move next spring and with a new administration. But it wouldn't be comprehensive immigration reform if it lacks something like this bilateral framework.
That's a very good point, actually. We'll take the answers in just a second. Let's pick up a couple more questions. Actually, Madam, would you like to ask your question now?
Hi, Emmy Simmons from Agree. I really enjoyed this kind of idea of shared responsibility and shared benefit that you put on the table. But it seems to me that sort of negotiate, what we've learned from globalization is that negotiations and sort of agreements, country, in a bilateral basis, one after the other, may not be the most efficient way to go. And looking at the future, it's quite clear that Central America is part of this sort of labor flow as well, and perhaps some of the countries in South America. How do you see kind of the recommendations that you're making here, specifically with regard to the US and Mexico, kind of being put into a broader sort of context and discussion of labor market migration sort of throughout the hemisphere?
Those are both very good questions. Let's get a couple of responses to those, and then we'll pick up more questions. Don't worry. First of all, panel, the question from the gentleman here talking about the term sheet that you've included. So an aspect of this report, if you look at Appendix B, is it? Appendix B? Appendix A is actually, they've drafted a term sheet on how an actual agreement might look. They've gone into that level of detail. And the question was, have you then identified champions in the Senate to try and tie this to comprehensive immigration reform? The point being that it wouldn't be comprehensive if it didn't include this.
Can I comment on that, unless you would like to?
Yeah.
It's an incredibly diverse group, and there were disagreements about many things. And actually, on both of these points that were just raised, there were disagreements in the group. There were people who said, look, it has to be the entire region or nothing. It has to be absolutely comprehensive. It has to be absolutely piecemeal. Much more important to this group is identifying tools for policymakers. There are elements of this agreement that could be implemented by an international agreement under existing law. One of them, for example, is the proposal that Mexico use its new labor law existing on the books to implement its existing authority to regulate recruiters for this labor in Mexico, which is de facto not done at all right now. And frankly, in the H-2 program and in other contexts, leads to tremendous abuses of migrants, including them getting frequently charged illegal fees. That is the kind of thing that would not require anything except what in Spanish they call a plumazo, just do it. There are other things that would require congressional action, that require legislative action in both countries, as some of the Bracero agreements did. And the group very deliberately didn't take a position on, this is our baby, it must be implemented pristine and whole in all of its elements as either administrative action or legislative. There are elements that could be used for either purpose.
That's an excellent question. Sorry.
And about the regional focus, I just couldn't agree more with what you're saying. And not many people realize that in terms of apprehensions at the border, last year was the first time ever, I believe, that more Central Americans than Mexicans were apprehended at the border. For demographic and economic reasons that are huge and historic, a big shift is taking place. There are the group decided from the beginning, and this was quite controversial, to just focus on this very important historic bilateral relationship. Just dealing with the complexities of Mexican and US law on this issue was enough to fill our discussions for many months, realizing that this is a regional issue. There are many models out there. Canada and Guatemala have had a bilateral labor agreement for many years. Canada and Mexico have. And hopefully an agreement between the US and Mexico could be used as an inspiration for how to make things work better with other countries. But essentially, from the beginning, and President Cedillo was adamant about this, let's not bite off more than we can chew to look beyond the start with the elephant in the room, and get to the rhinoceros later.
Carlos, Doris, would you like to comment? Would you like to add any comments to those two questions?
No, this is a walk before you run approach, and it most definitely would need legislation in order to actually take place. But this is an effort to try to, lead lawmakers to some ideas that they could buy into.
You think about the analogy of trade, bilateral trade agreements. The president needs trade promotion authorities so that they can negotiate and then just have a yes or no vote. Those are things that will have to be obviously discussed in the Senate. The Congress will have to do their parliamentary duties. Do they get a chance at nitpicking the agreement, or is it an up or down vote? But it's an excellent point, and eventually the Congress will have to deal with that.
Let's get some more questions. David, then this lady here, and then that gentleman there. We'll see how we're doing for time.
Hi, I'm David Smith from the Guardian newspaper in the UK. Just for our international audience, and excuse my ignorance, could you just sort of set out the status quo and the problem with it? You're saying that for low-wage workers at the moment, it's illegal to come, are you? And you're trying to create a legal mechanism. I was going to ask, would this agreement be unique? But you've mentioned that Canada has one or two already. Would this be unique for the United States? And are there any other analogies around the world, for example, like the movement of labor in the European Union?
Okay.
We'll
On your right, Jen.
Rebecca Smith, World Bank Labor Migration Team. I should start by admitting first that I have not read the full report yet, though I'm looking forward to doing so. But it seems that one of the innovations is kind of a shift towards an admission system based on a price mechanism for regulating entrance to the labor market, this fee, and as opposed to a quantity mechanism. And one of the things that we've seen in other countries that use that is that given the relative elasticities of workers and employers, the fee ends up being pushed on to the worker in the form of decreased salary or any number of different ways. So do you have a mechanism built in here to protect against that?
Okay, great. And let's get one third question. The gentleman over there in the blue suit.
Hi, thanks very much. Ted Alden with the Council on Foreign Relations. I was delighted to be part of the working group that produced this. Small role, but honored to be with this group. Wanted to ask you a bit about the security border enforcement piece of it. One of the interesting things from the history that you tease out a bit in this report is that the Border Patrol, you go back to the 1950s, they found the Bracero program very useful. It was a way to kind of distinguish people who were here legally from those who weren't. It was a legal alternative for people who may have come illegally. Talk a little bit more, if you could, about the ways in which a program like this might actually help the Border Patrol do their job more effectively.
Okay, let's take those questions in order then. I think, Michael, probably the first one is to you from David from The Guardian. Just, explain the kind of basics of this. Is it just basically full stop illegal?
So, being as brief as possible, the early 1990s, Clinton and Salinas talked about creating the North American Free Trade Agreement. And from at least 1992, very early in the process, addressing in any fashion low-skilled labor flows between the countries was ruled out. There is going to be no agreement if this is even on the table. So they talked about trade, they talked about investments, they created a new visa for the college-educated, the TN visa, addressing essentially every other form of economic, mutually beneficial economic exchange between these countries except low-skilled labor. Then you have NAFTA. Then 1995, the US Commission on Immigration Reform, stunningly, in retrospect, declares that the US doesn't actually need any more low-skilled labor. And from that point on, millions of people come in, and they come in to tremendously benefit the economy. As I said, making US workers more productive across the spectrum, low-skilled workers, high-skilled workers. The thing that was left off the table is a flexible and pragmatic way to address these flows. And there is, in US history, there are many precedents. In contemporary US, there are many bilateral agreements with much smaller countries. With Micronesia, for example, the US has open borders with Micronesia in exchange for putting military bases there. There are such things, but there's no precedent that I'm aware of for this in the current United States. We just have the abrogation of decades of cooperation in 1965 that, as Doris said, was followed quickly by a an epic wave of black market activity, and not at all by coincidence. Can I just briefly go to Rebecca's question before I pass it to you? The question is, what would prevent the fee from being passed on to workers? And the less important answer is that the agreement specifically states that these workers will be subject to all U.S. labor laws and be treated in the same way as U.S. workers, including for minimum wages. But that's not the real answer. The real answer is competition. The real answer is that by far the largest problem with the Bracero program, and it was a deep and poisonous flaw, was tying the workers to single employers, meaning they had no power to go down the road or across the country, or in practice to organize. The agreement says specifically that there will be no obstacle to the workers forming labor unions and exercising their power as sellers of their labor collectively to go on strike, and much more importantly, I believe in practical terms, to simply go to work for an employer who is not passing the fee on to them. And this is a critical protection, not only for their rights, but again, for the rights of US workers who are often working alongside them to make sure that the law is complied with, because really enforcement by distant agencies is not the principal mechanism to make sure rights get exercised. It is the ability to exercise market power, and that's only possible when you can leave an employer who is breaking the law.
If I could just add to that. So within a sector, the employee, the worker, can leave and stay in the same sector. They can leave the employer. And the Bracero program, you were tied to one employer. And that means your life depended on that one employer, which led to mistreatment of workers. It was almost like indentured servitude. So everybody thought it was a bad agreement, it was flawed, so we just took it out, but we didn't replace it. And if you go back, and we were talking about this today, Michael knows these numbers better than I do, but look at a chart where the Bracero program was taken out, and start tracking illegal immigration, start tracking the black market. And you can see that it's traced back to that decision. You take something out, you don't substitute it, or you don't think about a future flow.
Do you have comments to add to those points, Doris?
Not really to add, no.
So let's get answers to that third question from Ted Alden and CFR. How do you think a report like this is going to help Border Security, Border Patrol, do their jobs? You talk about the importance of clamping down on illegal cross-border movements. What's in it for them?
Please.
No, I mean, Ted knows this, very well, and so it's good to raise the point. Obviously, from the standpoint of border enforcement and the standpoint of law enforcement along the border, if there were to be a regulated flow where people had access to visas, they would be coming through the ports of entry. They would not be trying to sneak, through the desert. And you have to assume, a variety of other things that we're assuming in the kind of a redesigned program that this would be. But what you're banking on here is changing the incentives, creating a different incentive structure for labor market conditions that exist on both sides of the border, and that people will, in fact, take advantage of that. And that means that the border enforcement and the Border Patrol officer who's working on the border can be quite confident that the people that are therefore coming through where they're not supposed to be coming through are probably bad guys rather than everyday workers trying to exercise mobility. And this also is consistent with the ideas of circularity, the ideas of labor mobility that are part of globalization and part of the way in which economies and labor markets work most efficiently, but also it has to be consistent with protection of American workers, with legal processes, with some overall tax on the employers so that employers can't just dip into that labor market at the expense of others. I mean, this is, as Ted knows well, being on the group, an effort to try to put a whole set of things together that will hopefully build on lessons from the past. This is very much a reflection of lessons from the past and things that we can best guess, work through about what the future could look like.
Another innovation in the report is this concept of certified recruiters in Mexico who will recruit workers. They'll have their applications. They'll be, they'll substitute what a smuggler does today. And when you have someone who's in the business of smuggling people, they'll find ways to get them through. And that is bad for border security. Whether it's above or below or through some other means, that's their job is to get in illegally. With these certified recruiters, their job is to get workers in legally. That helps border security, and then you have this concept of joint accountability for the border, which is very much part of the bilateral agreement.
The gentleman from the Guardian asked about models. On that particular point, Jamaica is an excellent model. Their model for recruitment for the seasonal work visa is government regulation of a small universe of private recruiters. That is something that Mexico has the legal authority to do, but just doesn't do. And the U.S. washes its hands entirely. As long as you show up at the consulate to ask your visa, no questions are asked about how you got there. Jamaica, the H-2 visa was actually created for Jamaica in 1943. They have generations of experience with this, and this is a model that could be that has worked quite well and could be implemented. It just hasn't been.
Okay, we have another question over here from the lady in the yellow. Thanks for your patience. And then Anit over there, and then this lady here will probably be the last question. Let's take all three questions.
Hi, my name is Christina. I'm a reporter for Voice of America. I have a question for Doris. She mentioned that this is the right time to do this type of change, but with the campaign and the elections, I've been noticed that we kind of have like a polarized opinion in the country of what, undocumented immigrants should be doing here, and on the other side we have, we have to be more accepted. These persons are working here, they're helping us, why do you think this, based on the November elections, do you think this type of plan will work in either side of the politics, even though the Republicans win or Democrats, if you see something that is gonna be, is gonna work for each one of them? And then one question that I think you kind of already answered is that if someone from Central America comes here and they have to pay for their papers so they can have their working visa, usually they work, and correct me if I'm wrong, for small businesses who don't have the money to pay for those papers. We have a lot of small businesses here who need, this type of workers, construction, restaurants. They usually don't pay for that because it's expensive. Immigration papers are expensive. And usually people who come here, they don't have the money to pay those. Is there a way in the plan that you have, maybe that state government can help with those payments, or if something that maybe the Congress should address, or in the plan, is there something specific about this?
Okay, there's two questions there. Do you want to just answer those? Let's get a couple of responses to those now. Doris, the first one was specifically to you.
Well, when I say this is a good time for it, I don't mean today and tomorrow. I mean, the election will be over in a couple of weeks. And, we're talking about putting some ideas on the table that help to spark a different conversation. And that's a kind of a conversation that will take place in the coming year and several years. I mean, when I say a good time, I'm saying a good time historically, in that the flows are at the lowest level that they've been at, as Michael says, in his lifetime, not in my lifetime, but in his lifetime. And, you know, since we've been tracking these issues since 1970. So this is clearly a longer term effort. But I also believe that given the visibility that immigration has had and the centrality that it has had in this election campaign, that regardless of how the election comes out, there will be a post-election debate about immigration. And there will be discussion in the Congress about where to go on immigration. It may not result in a different outcome than we've seen in the past, but it may. And so this is an effort to put some thinking into that mix to try to help that conversation from being less stale than it has been in the past.
And the other question there from Christina was about many migrant workers work for small businesses who can't afford to pay for visa costs. Is there some mechanism or some kind of clause in the report that addresses that?
I want to talk about workers and employers. I mean, the fundamental way to ensure that workers are not paying exorbitant and abusive fees is making a well-regulated framework for this to happen. Because the alternative now is that you pay a smuggler several thousands of dollars, and by the way, that money often goes to organized crime and fuels violence. And as Rajesh mentioned, it is just a lose-lose for everybody. Capturing a small portion of that dramatically decreases the burden on migrants themselves. And one of the things the report discusses is that there should be different standards in such a report, in such an agreement, a real negotiated agreement for large businesses and for small businesses, recognizing that the ability of BP to get large numbers of temporary workers for biofuel plantations is just fundamentally different from the ability of a small restaurant to get one person to work in the back kitchen. I think it's absolutely appropriate to have what economists would call price discrimination, to have a schedule of different kinds of fees for different businesses, so that it's in the incentives of small businesses and large businesses to participate collectively in a well-regulated environment. Exactly what defines a small business or the degree to which the fees should differ, those aren't the kind of details that you'll find in the framework agreement, because the group felt that those are the kind of things that parties should get into specifics about themselves, and it wouldn't be productive for us to say, well, you know, the fee should be 3% for small business and 6% for big business. But the principle, I think, is very important.
Okay, let's pick up the last couple of questions. Anit there, and then this lady here, and this will probably be it.
Anit Mukherjee from Center for Global Development. First of all, many congratulations for the report, and look forward to reading it. And there's a Spanish part as well, so I can send it off to my friends in Mexico to read it as well. I come from a part of the world, which is South Asia, where the same report can be used by changing the two countries, India and Bangladesh, for example. And I'm very intrigued and happy that you've gone far ahead than what we have even started thinking about how to regulate cross-border flows and illegal immigration. One of the key problems that we face in that part of the world is the whole vested interest. Since we never had an agreement, there's always been vested interests, but here I understand that there was an agreement and then a vacuum. So I want to draw lessons from your report and understand how the downside risks of tackling this, the vested interests in your labor agreement has been addressed, how that can be a lesson for all of us. Secondly, the debate, even here a little bit that I know, and in South Asia, the states around the border are more vocal both in their opposition as well as probably in their interest in having a labor agreement, whereas as you go further away from the border, the debate kind of peters down. Is there any kind of way in which you have addressed the immediate concerns of the immediate neighbors, and as you go further up, the other states, which the demands might be different?
Okay, let's pick up the last question from this lady here. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Shannon Lederer, the Director of Immigration Policy for the AFL-CIO, America's Labor Movement. And so, as you might imagine, I'm reading quickly through this report with immense interest, and have many very detailed and specific questions that I'd love to explore further later. You may be aware that the labor movement since 2009 has advocated for something very similar to the commission that you have articulated here, that would look overall across all of our work visa categories at a more rational and coherent system for having them be truly responsive to the needs of the labor market and not fixed in time. So we do see some areas of shared analysis. I think that just in the interest of raising one macro question, it does not appear to me that you're limiting the access in terms of the vision that you see here of the sectors to those that are seasonal. And so I guess I'm sort of hearing some somewhat discomforting social hierarchy-like arguments being articulated in terms of types of jobs appropriate for different types of workers. And so I guess my macro question is, if there are identified needs in the labor market for non-seasonal jobs, why would we be restricting those workers who would fill them to temporary migration programs? And is there a vision for what a more permanent migration model might look like if there are permanent needs in the labor market?
Okay, let's actually respond to that point first. Okay. Actually, the seasonal, non-seasonal issue. You want to take that on?
Sure. So thank you very much, and I would love to talk with you more about the reports. I'm very, very interested in. This is in saying that U.S. employers are easily able to find U.S. workers for some jobs and not for other jobs. Just to me as an economist, that's just an observed fact about the world that you can see in data. I don't mean to establish any sort of social hierarchy to say that some jobs are better than others or that some people who fill some jobs are better than others. Nothing of the kind. I think it's just quite to the contrary. I think that there's a myth out there, and it's an extraordinarily dominant myth, that somehow the U.S. only needs high-skilled workers. That it's Silicon Valley now, and all we need is computer programmers from Seattle or Bangalore, and we'll be fine. And I think what very few people realize is that Silicon Valley runs mostly on less skilled labor. It runs on childcare, it runs on construction work, it runs on agricultural work, it runs on security personnel, on cleaners, on all kinds of labor that is absolutely essential to the modern economy. And far from putting it at the bottom, I depend on it daily, and I put it at the top. It's at the top of my life. I think it's a fundamental and critical question. Why have any temporary visas for year-round labor? For example, the dairy industry can't access the H-2A program because the Department of Labor has determined that their needs are not seasonal. So to fill most of the jobs that they have on dairy farms, they can't access that legal channel for labor. Their only alternative is to hire on the U.S. market, and that is very difficult sometimes, and particularly in some places to do. Now, if Congress is willing to create an employment-based green card category that is larger than I would I wouldn't hesitate to say, ridiculously small one that we have now. There is an employment-based green card category for low-skilled workers, but it is built around this myth that we only need high-skilled workers, I think, which is at odds with the real economy. And if Congress would be willing to adjust that ludicrously small quota to the economic and demographic reality of the US labor market, that would be something that would be very important to discuss. I don't think that's going to happen ever, if I had to make just a descriptive prediction. And the question becomes, what is a way to, with that constraint, to address the vast, tremendous generational harms of the black market that the illegalization of all of this essential labor has created. And I think starting with temporary employment-based flows is a reasonable way to start. The group is explicit in the report about there being no barrier at all for the people who take such temporary employment visas from pursuing permanent residence and citizenship later, according to the requirements that are set for that. They don't make, this group doesn't make any quantitative recommendation about how many people filling temporary visas should be admitted for permanent residence, because we decided early on that wasn't in the purview of the group, that we wanted to talk about this critical leading edge issue. But the idea is certainly not to relegate people to a temporary status of never accessing green cards, never accessing citizenship. I think the group considered that to be an absolutely critical but fundamentally separate question. I think it's an important issue to discuss whether there should be any year-round temporary employment visas in America, but we do have them. I don't see a short-term viable alternative to them other than the black market, in that employment-based visa categories that are more permanent for low-skilled labor are extraordinarily tightly constrained, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. But if there could be an opportunity for that, I think it would be another and very interesting way to address the same problem. It's not just one. It's just not one that this group chose to pursue.
It's an excellent question, because immigration policy is full of unintended consequences. Everywhere you look, the reason we don't use, farmers don't use the low-skilled farm worker process that exists is because it is so cumbersome. And it is full of, approvals and agencies, and it takes 4 months to get a worker. By that time, your harvest is gone. So again, the unintended consequences is that the employer has to access the black market. So one unintended consequence could be that we give a temporary worker status to someone who's occupying a job that isn't seasonal. And those are the issues that we have to look at. We have to be pragmatic, but around every corner, we've got to be thinking about what are the unintended consequences, because we're living through today an enormous amount of issues that lead to unintended consequences.
Okay.
Can I get to Anit's question?
Well, actually, I'm going to ask if you guys could do that privately, because you do work in the same office. We are actually a few minutes over time.
Good question.
So sorry, Anit. As they say, family hold back. But for now, I'm going to ask you all if you would thank the panel for a very, very interesting discussion today. Thank you, panel. Ladies, thank you for joining us this morning. Please take the reports with you, digest them, think about them, and engage with us. We'd love to hear more your thoughts about the issues that we've raised in. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's very, very interesting. Thank you.